Hi, I'm Nicholas Floyd, the author of 7 Nights with Ayahuasca, and this is the 4th video in my series regarding some advice before doing an ayahuasca retreat. In this video, I'll be talking about the psychological effects of the intoxication, and I'll be breaking it up into its 4 phases of the come up, the plateau, the come down, and the residual after effects. About 20 or 30 minutes after drinking the brew, the effects started to kick in. And of course, before drinking the brew, I was already pretty anxious, but then on top of that, I also started to feel sort of a chemically induced anxiousness, and it didn't necessarily feel overtly negative or positive. It simply felt like something really big was about to happen. At this point, visually, there wasn't much going on if I had my eyes open, but if I closed my eyes, I started to see colorful geometric patterns, kind of like a kaleidoscope. And these kaleidoscope patterns were pretty soothing and kind of melted away the anxiousness that I was feeling. About this time, I started to notice that my thoughts were sounding foreign to me, as if I were listening to someone else's thinking. And the kaleidoscope patterns started to take shape into things that I recognized, so faces or animals or things of that nature. And I started to feel a drifting sensation. It's kind of like if you're really tired and you start nodding off. Similar to that, except that I was keenly aware of the drifting sensation, so it wasn't like I was losing consciousness or anything like that. And it was about this time that the full effects started to hit me. When the full effects started to hit, initially it was pretty frightening because the intoxication was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. So in the past, whether it was alcohol or MDMA or LSD or mushrooms, all of those to me felt like my consciousness or my perception were simply being altered in a strictly chemical manner. Whereas with ayahuasca, the intoxication actually felt alive and very intelligent, as if it were imposing its mind control over me. And when we think of mind control, we generally think of a perpetrator and a victim, as in some evil force taking control of someone against his will. But it wasn't anything like that. It didn't feel good or evil. It simply felt as if something immensely more powerful than me was taking over. To give a long and somewhat complicated analogy for this possession-like intoxication, let's say that my mind is like a blank canvas, and metaphorically speaking, in one hand I'm holding a paintbrush, and in the other hand I have a color palette. Just a simple color palette with the primary colors red, green, blue, nothing fancy. And with my paintbrush and my color palette, I can paint ideas and thoughts and whatnot on the canvas of my mind. And let's say that during alcohol intoxication, which I view as a dumbing down or a retardation of consciousness, the colors on my palette get smeared together and my paintbrush dries up and my hand is shaky and I just can't really paint anything that's worth painting. So opposite of that, under the influence of a psychedelic, for example mushrooms or LSD, I would find that on my color palette I have not just the primary colors but a whole new assortment of colors, so not just blue but also cyan and cerulean and aqua, and I have not just the one clunky medium-sized paintbrush, but I have several different sizes of paintbrushes, and I have a palette knife and paint thinner and all these new tools. And the canvas is not just a standard-sized canvas, but it's an enormous mural on the side of a wall. And if the dose of the psychedelic is high enough, then from time to time my hands just kind of go on autopilot and start painting some mind-blowing things that confound me as to where they came from. But the key thing is that it's still just me by myself with a paintbrush and a color palette. Now with ayahuasca intoxication, it's similar to the psychedelic scenario, except that it felt as if 2 invisible, immensely powerful arms wrapped around me from behind and gently took a hold of my wrists and essentially started running the show and taking control, painting ideas and thoughts and whatnot, and I had no say in the matter, so I could only just sit back and watch the show. But once the full effects of the intoxication took hold of me, then I wasn't just watching the show, I was in the show. And at that point, it's no longer accurate for me to even describe the experience as an ayahuasca vision, because to me that implies that the viewer is separate from the vision. And that wasn't the case at all. I was fully immersed and interacting with the experience. As I mentioned earlier, the possession-like qualities of the intoxication were fairly terrifying, and equally as terrifying was the depth of the immersive experience. There were several times where I truly felt like I had stepped through some sort of portal into another universe. The experience was actually a bit like dreaming in the sense that it was fully interactive, so I was walking around strange places and touching things and smelling things and talking to whomever I might run into. But unlike most dreams, my awareness of the experience was fully intact. On top of that, the realism of the experience was terrifying to the point that it actually forced me to question my sanity. And it's no exaggeration to say that with some of the higher doses, the ayahuasca experience was actually more realistic than my everyday experiences in the physical world. And initially that might sound impossible, that anything could be more realistic than reality. But if you think about it, my experience of everyday life is going to be diluted by the limitations of my sensory organs. So the vibrancy with which I see the world will be limited by how good my eyes are, and the clarity with which I hear things will be limited by how good my ears are, and so forth. But with the ayahuasca experience, you've essentially cut out the limiting factor of sensory organs because the entire experience is generated and contained within the mind. So it's experienced with perfect clarity and perfect vibrancy and all those things. Now, this idea that anything could be more realistic than reality actually isn't all that far-fetched, because I've experienced a similar phenomenon with lucid dreaming. And to clarify, when I say lucid dreaming, I'm not talking about a dream that's simply very realistic or very vivid. I'm talking about a proper lucid dream where within the dream I realize that I'm dreaming and then take control of the dream. So a number of my lucid dreams, similar to my ayahuasca experiences, have felt more realistic than physical reality. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where the entire experience of the lucid dream is generated and contained all within my mind, so it's undiluted by my sensory organs. And there are a number of other similarities between lucid dreaming and ayahuasca that's worth pointing out. For example, it's only within those two experiences that I have heard a deafening and unforgettable humming noise that just rattled my skull, and I've never heard anything like that in the physical world or in any other type of experience that I've had. Another similarity is both of them are fully immersive worlds where you are utterly convinced of their realism, but from which you can instantaneously exit back into the physical world. So in the case of lucid dreaming, simply by waking up, or in the case of ayahuasca, by opening your eyes, splashing water on your face, or doing whatever you have to do. The key difference, though, is that with ayahuasca, you can just as easily dive back into the immersive world simply by closing your eyes. But overall, I would say that lucid dreaming is the only thing that I'm aware of that's even remotely comparable to the ayahuasca experience. I feel like there were two main psychological effects that really made the experience so therapeutic for me. And the first psychological effect is that all of my unresolved issues bubbled to the surface, regardless of whether or not I was even aware that I had these issues. So, for example, at the time I was still thinking quite a bit about a bad breakup from the past, and so I wasn't very surprised when that was a recurring theme throughout my experience. But I was surprised when I found out that, unbeknownst to me at the time, I also had a very strong fear of death and a very strong fear of intimacy. And both of those were also recurring themes throughout my experience. And this psychological effect of unresolved issues bubbling to the surface, all by itself probably wouldn't be very therapeutic, because then I would just be reliving terrible experiences and being tortured by my fears and things like that. But the second psychological effect that I felt was essentially a complete dissolution of my ego and my defensiveness and my illogical rationalizations, my preconceived notions about myself. All these things were absent, which allowed me to partake in the experience objectively and to analyze it without any biases. And actually, quite a few of my experiences during ayahuasca intoxication were from a third person or from an outside perspective. So I would be seeing an interaction that I had with another person, but from the outside, or sometimes even from the other person's perspective. So in order to portray some of these psychological effects that I'm describing, and to give you a more concrete example of one of my experiences, I'm going to read a short excerpt from my book, and this is from the first ceremony about midway through, so I'm already at peak intoxication and I'm already fully immersed in the visions. From a third-person perspective, with the clarity and immersive realism of the physical world, I saw myself standing face to face with my ex-girlfriend. From an arm's length away, we looked into each other's eyes with a soft gaze that lacked any strong emotion, the same mellow gaze with which we had greeted each other upon waking each morning, still entangled and disheveled from the night before. Neither of us moved or even blinked. Emotionless and without a word, still staring into her eyes, I suddenly clenched my right hand into a rock-solid fist, raised it to shoulder height, and plunged it into her chest, smashing through her brittle ribcage. The force of the blow launched thick chunks of her bloody flesh into the air as my knuckles tore through her delicate body. Involuntary spasms contorted her face into a twitching grimace of shock and agony as I ground my fist deeper into her chest, spread open my fingers, and grabbed a hold of her heart. I felt its tough, muscular walls struggling against the tight grip of my stranglehold. She convulsed in excruciating pain as I yanked out her beating heart, her elastic arteries snapping like rubber bands one by one in quick succession. I held up her heart at eye level, and showers of blood squirted out to the rhythm of her frantic heartbeat, splattering my face and hers. A steady stream of blood ran down my forearm and dripped off my elbow into a pool on the ground as we both stood there in silence, hers from speechlessness, mine from cold indifference. Holding stern eye contact, I threw her convulsing heart at our feet, and it smashed into the ground with the squishy thud of a ripe tomato. The blood splatter of her beating heart painted our shoes red, matching her blood-soaked shirt, her mangled chest, and my blood-stained arm. Pools of blood coagulated into thick clumps of dark crimson mud at our feet. Making no attempt to wipe the splatters of blood from my face, I held my indifferent and unblinking gaze as she looked back at me with trembling eyes, soggy with tears and disbelief. I raised my right knee to waist height, and without even looking down to aim, I stomped her heart with all my strength, over and over, digging my heel into the sinewy mess of bloody tissue, twisting and grinding to wring out every last drop of blood. Tears flowed from her devastated eyes and coalesced with the blood splatters on her face, drawing erratic streaks of pink down her cheeks. Her shattered ribs protruded from the gaping hole in her chest, which still sprayed profuse blood at me as I broke eye contact for the first time, turned my back, and walked away without a word. She stood frozen in place, blindsided and devastated, unmoving except for her sulking shoulders, which heaved up and down with sharp breaths of silent, uncontrollable sobbing. Petrified by hysteria, she couldn't even wipe the streaming tears from her face, and I disappeared into the darkness, never once looking back at her. From the sidelines, my ego butted in with a vehement objection. "Oh, come on! The breakup wasn't that bad. I did my best to let her down easy." I wholeheartedly believed the assertion to be true, that I had done my best to let her down easy, but the calm and rational voice of my conscience offered a counter-argument. Maybe it wasn't that bad for you, but that's how it felt for her. The irrefutable truth hit me in the chest like a sledgehammer, tearing into me with the same ruthless violence with which I had torn into her, and I winced in pain at the realization of my own abysmal selfishness and callousness. With the cloak of egocentrism lifted, I saw for the first time the obvious and awful emotional damage that I had inflicted on her, and it absolutely broke my heart that I had broken her heart. Back in the physical world, tears welled up beneath my closed eyelids, filling the shallow reservoirs to the brim and then spilling out from the corners of my eyes. I lost track of time as a steady flow trickled down my cheeks, but I came to see the heart-wrenching devastation within me as more than just fruitless suffering. I saw it as emotional manure that, unpleasant as it was, fertilized a flower of self-improvement, because the vision compelled me to shed my self-centeredness, to burst my inflated ego and fill the void with empathy, and to never hurt anyone like that again. So from that, you can probably tell that there is also one other similarity between dreaming and ayahuasca intoxication, namely that both of them are experiences that take place entirely within your mind, but that your body will react to it as if it were actually happening to you in the physical world. So if we take dreaming, for example, if I'm asleep at night, lying in my bed, and I'm having a nightmare, then my body will react with increased heart rate, intensified breathing, sweating, things of that nature. And so too with ayahuasca, if I was having a very emotional experience, then tears would be streaming down my face and I would get choked up and things like that. And this is where I think vomiting actually comes into play. In the previous video, I mentioned that I think vomiting is more likely a psychological effect rather than a physical effect. I think it probably has a lot more to do with the contents of your mind rather than the contents of your stomach. So to illustrate this point, let's say for example I'm walking down the street in the physical world and there's a terrible car crash right in front of me. The driver smashes through the windshield and his dismembered and mangled body flops onto the street in front of me and he's twitching around and bleeding to death. That might cause me to vomit, not because of what's in my stomach, but because the scene is so disturbing. And in the same way, if you've had some real trauma in your life, or if you're carrying a lot of grief with you, and all of that bubbles to the surface and gets smushed in your face in a hyper-vivid, immersive experience like ayahuasca, then I could definitely see how that might cause a person to vomit. And even if you haven't had any real trauma in your life, even if you're just experiencing a very strong negative emotion, which is very likely during an ayahuasca experience, that strong negative emotion alone, I think, could definitely make a person vomit. But I think it's worth pointing out that almost universally, people say that the vomiting all by itself is very therapeutic and that they report feeling extremely refreshed afterwards, so it's not necessarily anything to be feared. Aside from a fear of vomiting, I've also heard people mention they're afraid to try ayahuasca because they think that they'll have a bad trip. And I'm not here to try to convince anyone that they should drink ayahuasca, but I think that the fear of a bad experience really kind of misses the point. The point being that, quite to the contrary, you want all of that bad stuff to come to the surface so that you can work through it and resolve your issues and better your life, rather than keeping all of that stuff bottled up and having that emotional baggage weigh you down all the time. So sure, throughout the ayahuasca experience, probably there are going to be some really difficult things that come up, but that's kind of what you're going for. I know that so far I may not have painted the most enticing picture of the ayahuasca experience, but it's important to remember that it's not so much about the experience itself, it's more about how you feel after the experience. And so for me, even though at times it was very difficult, when I think about what I got out of it in terms of personal insights and resolving emotional issues and things of that nature, absolutely it was worth it for me to go through those difficulties. By orders of magnitude, it was the most therapeutic experience in my life. It's also worth pointing out that not all of it was difficult. So out of the extreme experiences that I had, I would say about 50% maybe were difficult, but then the other 50% were euphoric and utterly blissful, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. For me, the come down was essentially the reverse of the come up. So the hyper-vivid and interactive, immersive visions that I was seeing would degrade into low intensity and non-interactive visions. So just kind of like watching movie clips playing in my mind. My thoughts would start to sound like my own once again. And I felt that same drifting sensation that I felt during the come up, except it was like drifting back into my body and becoming more acquainted with my surroundings. The grip of possession that I described would slowly loosen and weaken, and throughout the come down there would be occasional spikes in intensity, but more or less it was a pretty smooth come down. For the first hour or two after the come down, my mind was firing quite a bit and in a scatterbrained and erratic sort of fashion, almost as if I had taken a large dose of caffeine or some other stimulant. And I suffered from a little bit of lightheadedness and confusion as well. It was nothing terrible, but it did prevent coherent interactions with other people. The next day, mostly these effects had worn off, maybe a little bit of lightheadedness and a little bit of confusion. But opposite from a hangover, I actually felt great the next day. I had a positive afterglow that lasted for the majority of the day. I felt mentally and physically totally refreshed, and I didn't really have a care in the world. It was almost like being a kid again, where it felt great just to be alive. So that's it for this video, and this is the last video in the series, but separate from this series I'll also be uploading another video regarding some thoughts and ramblings about the nature of the ayahuasca experience and its implications and things like that. So if you enjoy listening to some dude spew a bunch of conjecture and talk out his ass about things that he has no expertise in, then I've got something that'll be right up your alley, so stick around.